My twin and I were enemies until we saw our uncle leaving Mom's house at 4 a.m. every night. I threw the first punch when we were 6. Liam broke my arm when we were 8. By the time we hit 15, our parents had spent more on hospital bills than college savings. We were identical twins who couldn't stand to breathe the same air. Mom used to joke that we'd come out of the womb fighting, that the doctor had to separate us before we killed each other. She stopped joking about it after Liam put me through a glass coffee table during Christmas dinner. That was the year we turned 17, the year everything changed, though we didn't know it yet. Our rivalry wasn't some cute sibling competition. It was genuine hatred, the kind that makes you wake up angry and fall asleep plotting revenge. If I got an A, Liam would forge my homework to get me an F. If he made the basketball team, I'd tell the coach about the Adderall in his locker. We sabotaged dates, destroyed property, spread rumors that ruined friendships. Our younger sister Ivy learned to hide in her room when we were both home. Dad moved out when we were 14, said he couldn't watch his sons destroy each other anymore. Mom stayed because someone had to, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes every time she had to pull us apart. The night everything started, I was 19 and home from my first semester at State. Liam had gone to the community college across town specifically because I'd chosen State. We'd managed to avoid each other for 4 months, and coming home for winter break felt like walking into a war zone. Mom picked me up from the bus station alone, which should have been my first clue. Something was wrong. She looked thinner, older, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. The drive home was quiet except for the radio, and she kept checking her phone at every red light. Liam was waiting in the driveway when we pulled up, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed. He'd grown his hair out and gotten a tattoo on his forearm, some kind of geometric pattern I couldn't make out from the car. We locked eyes through the windshield, and I saw the same cold hatred I'd been carrying around my entire life. Mom sighed and said she needed to run to the grocery store, which was obviously a lie to avoid being there when we inevitably started fighting. She left us standing 20 feet apart in the driveway, the December air so cold our breath came out in clouds. Neither of us threw a punch. We just stood there staring, waiting for the other to make the first move, until Ivy opened the front door and yelled that dinner would be ready in an hour. The moment broke, and Liam walked past me into the house, his shoulder deliberately clipping mine hard enough to spin me slightly. I grabbed my bag and followed him inside, already planning how I'd make his break miserable. The house felt different, smaller somehow, and there was a staleness in the air like windows hadn't been opened in weeks. Ivy hugged me in the kitchen and whispered that Mom had been acting weird lately, distracted and jumpy. That first night home, I couldn't sleep. My old bedroom felt foreign after months away, and I could hear Liam moving around in his room next door. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a car door close outside. I got up and looked out my window, expecting to see a neighbor coming home late. Instead, I saw Uncle Ray walking up our driveway. He was Mom's younger brother, a guy we'd only seen maybe twice a year at family gatherings. He was dressed in jeans and a jacket, and he was using a key to unlock our front door. I watched him disappear inside, my brain trying to make sense of why he'd be here at 3 in the morning with his own key. I crept downstairs and heard voices in the kitchen, Mom and Uncle Ray talking in low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but Mom's voice sounded stressed. I stood in the hallway debating whether to confront them when I heard Liam's door open upstairs. I rushed back up and ran into him on the landing. We both froze, and for once we weren't looking at each other with hatred. We were looking at each other with the same confused question. Liam mouthed, "What the fuck?" And I shrugged. We stood there listening until we heard Uncle Ray leave through the front door around 4:30. Mom went upstairs to her room, and we heard her door close. The next morning at breakfast, Mom acted completely normal. She made pancakes and asked about our classes like nothing had happened. Liam and I kept glancing at each other across the table, this unspoken agreement forming between us for the first time in our lives. After breakfast, Mom said she had errands to run and left. The moment her car pulled out, Liam turned to me. "You saw Ray too?" His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure if this was some elaborate prank I was pulling. I nodded and told him what time I'd seen Uncle Ray arrive and leave. Liam's jaw tightened, and he said Ray had been there the night before I came home too. Same time. We spent that day in an uncomfortable truce, barely speaking, but constantly aware of each other's presence. That night, we both stayed awake. At 3:15, we heard a car door. I met Liam in the hallway, and we went to his window that had a better view of the driveway. Uncle Ray's truck pulled up, and we watched him use his key again to enter the house. The kitchen light came on, and we heard the murmur of voices. This time, Liam crept downstairs first, and I followed close behind. We positioned ourselves in the hallway where we could hear better. Mom was crying softly, and Uncle Ray's voice was low and soothing. We couldn't make out full sentences, just fragments. "Can't keep doing this," from Mom. "Have to protect," from Uncle Ray. "What if they find out?" from Mom again. Liam looked at me and mouthed, "Affair?" I shrugged, because it seemed like the obvious explanation, but something felt wrong about it. Uncle Ray was married to Aunt Linda, had 2 kids of his own, and the way Mom was crying didn't sound romantic. It sounded scared. We stayed there until we heard movement, then rushed back upstairs. From Liam's window, we watched Uncle Ray leave at 4:20. He sat in his truck for a few minutes before driving away, and we could see him on his phone, typing furiously. Mom stood at the kitchen window watching him leave, and even from above we could see how her shoulders were shaking. The next morning, Liam cornered me in my room before breakfast. "We need to find out what's going on." It was the first time he'd voluntarily spoken to me without an insult in probably 15 years. I agreed because whatever was happening was clearly hurting Mom, and despite everything, we both loved her. We made a plan to stake out the house that night with our phones ready to record. At breakfast, Mom looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. She kept checking her phone and startling at every notification. Ivy asked if she was okay, and Mom snapped at her, then immediately apologized and left the table. That night, Liam and I sat up in the living room with the lights off. We'd told Mom we were going to a late movie, then snuck back in through the basement door. We positioned ourselves behind the couch where we could see the front door and kitchen entrance. At 3:10, right on schedule, we heard Uncle Ray's truck, the key in the lock, Mom appearing from upstairs in her robe. They went to the kitchen and we crawled closer, my phone already recording audio. This time we heard more. Uncle Ray was saying something about checking the accounts and making sure they don't trace it. Mom said, "What about the kids?" And Uncle Ray responded, "They can't know, especially not the twins." Liam and I looked at each other, and I could see my own confusion reflected in his face. This wasn't an affair. This was something else, something that involved money and secrecy, and specifically keeping us in the dark. We kept recording as they talked for over an hour. Uncle Ray mentioned someone named Victor, said, "He's getting suspicious." Mom said something about the paperwork, and if they audit. Uncle Ray assured her it would be fine, that he'd handled everything on his end. Before he left, he said, 3 more months, and we're clear. After Uncle Ray left, Liam and I snuck back to his room and listened to the recording 4 times, trying to piece together what we'd heard. It sounded like some kind of financial fraud or embezzlement. Mom and Uncle Ray were involved in something illegal, something they were desperately trying to hide. Liam pulled up Uncle Ray's Facebook and started scrolling through his photos. He worked as an accountant at a mid-size firm downtown. Mom worked in HR at a hospital. Neither job seemed like it would involve the kind of money laundering or fraud they were clearly discussing. The next day, I called Dad for the first time in months. We met at a coffee shop and I asked him straight out if Mom had money problems. He looked surprised and said, not that he knew of, that their divorce settlement had been clean and she'd gotten the house free and clear. He asked why I was asking, and I made up something about her seeming stressed. Dad said Mom had always been private about money, that even when they were married she'd kept separate accounts he never saw. He mentioned that Uncle Ray had helped her with some investments years ago, but he didn't know details. When I got home, Liam was on his laptop at the kitchen table. He'd been digging through public records and found something interesting. Uncle Ray's accounting firm had been investigated by the IRS 2 years ago for irregularities in client accounts. Nothing had been proven, but 3 employees had been let go. Uncle Ray had kept his job, which either meant he was innocent or he was good at covering his tracks. Liam had also found Mom's LinkedIn profile, where she listed a side consulting business we'd never heard about. We looked up the business registration and found it was an LLC formed 5 years ago, with Uncle Ray listed as the co-founder. That night, we confronted Mom. We waited until Ivy went to her friend's house, then sat Mom down in the living room and played the recording. We watched the color drain from her face. She stood up, sat down, stood up again. She asked where we got it, and Liam told her we'd been watching Uncle Ray come and go for days. Mom started crying, really sobbing, and said we shouldn't have done that we'd made everything more complicated. I asked her what exactly was going on, and she said she couldn't tell us, that it was for our own protection. Liam lost it. He stood up and yelled that he was tired of being protected, that we deserved to know why our uncle was sneaking into the house at 3 in the morning, talking about fraud and audits. Mom flinched, but stayed quiet. I tried a different approach, keeping my voice calm. I told her that whatever trouble she was in, we could help, that keeping us in the dark was only making it worse. She looked between us, maybe seeing for the first time that we were united instead of at each other's throats. Then she told us to sit down, because it was going to take a while to explain. Mom started with our father. She said what we knew about their divorce was only half true. Yes, they'd grown apart, but the real reason Dad left was because he'd discovered money missing from their joint savings. Almost $80,000, gone over the course of 2 years. Dad had accused Mom of gambling or having a drug problem. She'd denied it, refused to explain where the money went, and he'd filed for divorce. The money had actually gone to Uncle Ray, or more specifically, to covering up something Uncle Ray had done. 5 years ago, Uncle Ray had been managing accounts for a wealthy client named Victor Rousseau. Victor was a real estate developer with properties all over the state. Uncle Ray had gotten greedy and started skimming money from Victor's accounts, just small amounts at first, then larger sums. He'd used the money to pay off his own debts, credit cards, and a second mortgage he'd kept secret from Aunt Linda. By the time he realized how deep he was, he'd taken almost $200,000. When Victor's accountant noticed the discrepancies, Uncle Ray panicked and came to Mom. Mom had helped him create a shell company to funnel money back into Victor's accounts, making it look like legitimate business expenses and returns. They'd used Mom's HR access to create fake employee records at her hospital, people who didn't exist, but who were receiving paychecks that were actually going to repay Victor. It was elaborate fraud, identity theft, money laundering, all to cover up Uncle Ray's initial theft. They'd been doing this for 5 years, slowly paying back what Uncle Ray stole, while creating an increasingly complex paper trail that could implode at any moment. The reason Uncle Ray was coming over at 3 in the morning was because that's when Mom would get off her night shift at the hospital, and they'd coordinate the fake employee paperwork. They had to do it in person because electronic communication could be traced. The 3 months Uncle Ray mentioned was how long they had left before the last of the stolen money would be repaid, and they could dissolve the shell company and delete the fake employees. 3 months until they were free, if they could just keep everything hidden that long. Liam asked why Mom couldn't just turn Uncle Ray in, let him face the consequences of his own theft. Mom's face crumpled, and she said that if Uncle Ray went to prison, Aunt Linda would lose the house, their kids would lose everything, and the investigation would reveal Mom's involvement. She'd go to prison too. We'd lose the house. Ivy would end up in foster care since Dad wouldn't take her after she'd helped cover up a felony. Mom had made a choice to protect her brother, and now we were all trapped in the consequences of that choice. I sat there processing everything, watching my mom admit to years of fraud like she was confessing to leaving dishes in the sink. Liam was pacing, his hands in his hair, breathing hard. Finally, he turned and asked the question I was thinking. What happens if you get caught? Mom said quietly that she'd lose her job, her nursing license, probably go to prison for 3 to 5 years. Uncle Ray would face similar charges. Everything we owned would be seized as proceeds of crime. She'd been living in terror for 5 years, barely sleeping, constantly waiting for the police to show up. The next few days were strange. Liam and I didn't fight because we were too busy being angry at Mom and Uncle Ray. But it wasn't the clean anger we were used to directing at each other. It was complicated, mixed with fear and betrayal and reluctant understanding. We watched Mom go through her days pretending everything was normal, watched her jump at every knock on the door. Uncle Ray kept making his 3 a.m. visits, and now that we knew what they were doing, the low conversations in the kitchen felt even more sinister. A week after Mom's confession, I was going through the mail and found a letter addressed to Mom from the IRS. My hands shook as I brought it to her. She opened it right there in the kitchen, with Liam and me watching over her shoulder. It was a notice of audit for her hospital's payroll records for the past 2 years. They'd selected her department for a random compliance check. Mom sat down hard in a chair, and the letter fell from her hands. The audit was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. The fake employees would be discovered immediately. Mom called Uncle Ray, and he came over that afternoon, not caring that it was daylight or that his car would be seen in our driveway. They locked themselves in the kitchen for 3 hours while Liam and I waited in the living room with Ivy, who kept asking what was wrong. Finally, Uncle Ray left, looking gray and shaken. Mom came out and told us they had 2 options. They could run, disappear with fake IDs and leave everything behind, or they could come clean, turn themselves in before the audit, and hope for leniency. Liam asked what happened if they ran. Mom said we'd never see her again, that Ivy would go live with Dad, that our family would be completely destroyed, but at least Mom would be free. If they turned themselves in, Mom and Uncle Ray would both go to prison, but it would be shorter sentences, and there was a chance we could keep the house if the prosecutors believed Mom wasn't the mastermind. Either option was terrible. Either option meant our mother was gone. That night, Liam and I sat in his truck in the driveway, not speaking for the longest time. Finally, he said he'd been thinking. There might be a third option. I asked what, and he said we needed to meet Victor Rousseau. If we could convince Victor that the money had been paid back, that prosecuting Mom and Uncle Ray would accomplish nothing except destroying two families, maybe he'd drop it. Maybe he'd tell the IRS the audit wasn't necessary. I thought Liam had lost his mind, but he was already looking up Victor's office address on his phone. We drove downtown the next morning without telling Mom. Victor's office was in one of those glass towers with marble lobbies and security guards. We got past the front desk by saying we were Uncle Ray's nephews with an urgent family matter. The secretary looked skeptical, but called up, and to our surprise, Victor agreed to see us. We took the elevator to the 15th floor and were led into an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victor Rousseau was maybe 50, with gray hair and expensive suit. He gestured for us to sit and asked what this was about. I looked at Liam, and in that moment of silence, we made a decision without words. Liam started talking, telling Victor everything, how Uncle Ray had stolen from him, how Mom had helped cover it up, how they'd been paying back the money for 5 years, how the audit would destroy our family. Victor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Liam finished, Victor leaned back in his chair. He said he'd known about the theft for 3 years. His accountant had flagged the irregularities, and Victor had hired a private investigator who'd uncovered the whole scheme. He'd known about Mom, about the fake employees, about everything. I asked why he hadn't gone to the police, and Victor said that Uncle Ray was paying the money back, and Victor had been making careful notes of every transaction. He planned to use the evidence to ruin Uncle Ray professionally when the time was right, to make sure he could never work as an accountant again. Victor stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city. He said he'd built his fortune from nothing, that he'd clawed his way up from poverty by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around him. When people stole from him, he didn't just want his money back, he wanted them to suffer. The audit wasn't random. Victor had called in a favor with someone at the IRS specifically to expose Uncle Ray and Mom. He'd been waiting 5 years to spring this trap. Liam stood up, his fists clenched. I grabbed his arm because I could see him calculating whether he could take Victor in a fight. Victor noticed and smiled slightly. He said violence wouldn't help us, that everything was already in motion. The audit would happen, the fake employees would be discovered, and Mom and Uncle Ray would go to prison. He'd have his money back and his revenge. We'd lost before we'd even walked into his office. I asked Victor what he wanted. There had to be something, some reason he'd agreed to see us if it was all already decided. Victor turned from the window and studied us for a long moment. He said he wanted one thing, the one thing Uncle Ray had never given him, a genuine apology and public admission of guilt. If Uncle Ray would write a detailed confession, sign it in front of a notary, and hand over his accounting license voluntarily, Victor would call off the audit. He'd consider the debt paid, not just financially, but morally. Liam asked why that mattered, why a confession would be enough when Victor could have Mom and Uncle Ray arrested. Victor said that prison wouldn't hurt Uncle Ray as much as professional ruin would. Uncle Ray's entire identity was built on being a successful accountant, on being the smart one who managed other people's money. Taking that away, forcing him to admit he was a thief and a fraud, that would destroy him more completely than a jail cell. And Mom would be spared, which Victor said he was willing to do because she'd been protecting her brother, not enriching herself. We left Victor's office with his terms. Uncle Ray had 1 week to deliver the confession, or the audit would proceed as planned. We drove straight to Uncle Ray's house and made him and Aunt Linda sit down while we explained everything. Aunt Linda had no idea about any of it. She screamed at Uncle Ray, asking how he could be so stupid and selfish. Their kids came downstairs to see what the shouting was about, and we had to leave while the family imploded. The next 3 days were chaos. Uncle Ray refused at first, said he'd rather go to prison than humiliate himself with a confession. Mom begged him, reminding him that her freedom depended on it. Aunt Linda filed for separation and took the kids to her mother's house. Uncle Ray showed up at our house at noon, drunk, saying his life was over either way. Liam and I physically dragged him to the shower and forced him to sober up while Mom made coffee. Finally, on the 4th day, Uncle Ray agreed. We drove him to Victor's office where a notary was waiting. Uncle Ray wrote out a confession detailing every dollar he'd stolen, every fake employee, every fraudulent transaction. He signed it in shaking handwriting. Victor read it, nodded, and made a phone call right there. We heard him tell someone at the IRS that the audit on Mom's hospital was no longer necessary, that he'd resolved the matter internally. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. 5 years of terror ended with a brief phone conversation. Victor stood and told Uncle Ray he had 24 hours to surrender his CPA license to the state board. If he didn't, Victor would release the confession to the police. Uncle Ray nodded numbly. As we turned to leave, Victor said one more thing. He told Mom that he was sorry she'd been pulled into her brother's mess, that he could see she'd been trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. He hoped she'd be more careful about who she tried to protect in the future. Mom just nodded, too exhausted for words. The aftermath was almost worse than the crime. Uncle Ray surrendered his license and had to explain to his firm why he was suddenly quitting. They suspected something but couldn't prove anything without Victor's cooperation. Aunt Linda filed for divorce and got full custody of the kids. Uncle Ray moved into a studio apartment and took a job as a grocery store manager. The career he'd spent 15 years building was gone, and everyone in his professional circle knew something had happened, even if they didn't know details. Mom kept her job because the audit was canceled before it began, so the fake employees were never officially discovered. She dissolved the shell company and deleted all the fraudulent records, covering her tracks one final time. But she was different after, quieter, jumping less at sounds, but smiling less too. She'd been carrying crushing guilt for 5 years, and now it was replaced with a different kind of weight, knowing she'd gotten away with it while her brother's life fell apart. Liam and I had to recalibrate our entire relationship. We'd spent 19 years as enemies, and suddenly, we'd been through this intense experience together. The hatred was still there, ingrained like muscle memory, but it was mixed with something else now. We'd worked together, protected Mom together, faced down Victor Rousseau together. We didn't suddenly become best friends, but we stopped actively trying to destroy each other. 2 months later, Liam and I were both back at our respective schools. We texted sometimes, just practical stuff about Mom or Ivy, nothing deep. But it was communication, which was more than we'd had before. During spring break, we ended up at the same bar downtown without planning it. We saw each other across the room, and instead of leaving or starting a fight, we nodded. Liam came over to where I was sitting, and we had a beer together. We didn't talk about what had happened, but we didn't need to. The summer after, Mom sat us down and said she'd been seeing a therapist. She wanted to understand why she'd made the choice to help Uncle Ray, to risk everything for someone who'd been so reckless. The therapist had helped her see patterns from their childhood, how she'd always protected her younger brother, how their parents had made that her job. She was learning to set boundaries, to understand that protecting people sometimes meant letting them face consequences. She apologized to us for putting our family at risk, for the years of stress we'd witnessed without understanding. Liam and I both ended up in therapy too, separately at first. My therapist asked why I thought my brother and I had hated each other so intensely. I'd always assumed it was just how twins were, some evolutionary competition thing. But she pushed me to dig deeper, and slowly I realized we'd been fighting for Mom's attention in a house where she'd been distracted and terrified for years. We'd sensed something was wrong without knowing what, and we'd channeled that anxiety into destroying each other. Understanding didn't erase 19 years of genuine animosity, but it helped explain it. Uncle Ray never recovered his career. He bounced between low-wage jobs, barely making child support payments. His kids refused to see him after they learned what he'd done. Aunt Linda remarried 2 years later to a dentist who treated the kids well. Uncle Ray sent a Christmas card the first year after everything happened. Mom looked at it for a long time before throwing it away unopened. She'd saved him, and it had nearly destroyed her. She was done protecting him from himself. 3 years after that night when Liam and I first saw Uncle Ray leaving the house, we were at Ivy's high school graduation. She gave a speech about resilience and family, about how the people you love can surprise you when things get hard. She looked right at Liam and me in the audience, and we both knew she was talking about us. After the ceremony, Liam and I stood on opposite sides of the parking lot, far enough apart that we could pretend we weren't together, close enough that Mom could take a photo with all 3 of her kids. The photo sits on Mom's mantle now. 3 kids who survived their mother's crime, 2 twins who learned to stop trying to kill each other, a family that nearly imploded but held together through sheer stubborn will. We're not close, Liam and I. We probably never will be. But we're not enemies anymore either. We're brothers who know each other's worst qualities, who've seen each other at rock bottom, who faced down a real enemy together when it mattered. That has to count for something.